All right, everyone, welcome back to the Ramped podcast. Today, I am joined with Chad Caples. Chad, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Chad, you're somebody that we've obviously admired from afar. You worked at Genworth for quite some time. Before we jump into all these questions that I have for you on the future of work and some of the other things that we want to talk about today, who is Chad Caples?
Yeah, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a friend, I'm an ally. I'm someone who is foodie obsessed and probably equally obsessed with live music. I'm someone who I'm a people pleaser. I love to see smiles on people's faces when they made a big splash in an organization, also when that organization's made a big impact on them. Been in the TA space now for close to 20 years and love it.
Sweet. And today it looks like we are rocking rival schools, or not so much rival, but maybe rival business schools. We got Michigan and Virginia represented on the podcast. Cool. Well, let's jump into some of the questions. Let's talk about some of your experience in TA. Because a lot of times we're hearing folks, especially in our audience, talk about what they're going to do next or what they're going to do first in their career. Do you have a framework, or do you know of a way that you can coach folks into how they should think about that first step in their early career?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate it. I think certainly important for people who are earlier in their career is to try and think of their career as a marathon and not a sprint, right? I think it's important that even if you aren't successful and identifying the role or industry that you want long term right off the bat, that's okay, right? You just don't waste your time in terms of find a way to focus your development on skills and experiences and competencies that you can gain, and understand the difference too between those three. They're not one and the same. I always encourage people at all levels, but I think particular earlier career is take yourself out of your comfort zone, be open-minded to the types of interactions and learnings. To me, early in your career, especially, it's as much as understanding not just what you do, you may be interested in, as it is what you don't like and you don't want to do. And don't think of your career as a ladder, right? Well, more realistically, it's probably a jungle gym. So if you think of it strictly as in a linear progression, you're more than likely going to set yourself up for some disappointment in some ways.
Yeah, super helpful. Very, very good strategic advice there. I'm curious to know, so when you're in that early career phase, and we've talked to thousands of early career professionals about to embark on this first step in their journey, and a lot of times they're saying stuff like, hey, I'm just stymied by this decision. I don't know what I want to do. They don't think of it, like you mentioned, as a marathon. They do think of it as like, I got to get ahead. I got to get ahead. I got to get ahead. Like, how do you calm folks down and really help them see that in that moment, the most important thing is X? What do you do there?
Yeah, I think, again, not just important to early career folks, but I think in particular important to early career folks because of perhaps the lack of professional experience and perspective that they may have. Is I encourage anyone earlier in their career to do their best to try and put together what I call kind of a board of directors, right? A group of people who, it doesn't have to be extensive, but a group of people who know them well enough that they understand that person, they understand how that person ticks, they understand that person's desires and wants and blind spots, but they're comfortable enough with that person too that they have no problem giving them the objective feedback that person may need to hear, and they may not get from a parent, they may not get from a spouse or a partner or a friend. And I think that's kind of part and parcel of early career people really focusing on investing in themselves, right? Sometimes you see early career folks get frustrated because the organization's not doing X. But I think it's really important to kind of take an inventory of those around you. And more often than not, those folks are very open to sharing their perspectives and experiences that could benefit you as an early career professional. I don't think I've ever met a leader in my career who wasn't more partial to mentoring that early career professional who was vocal about being exposed to new things and throwing their hat in the ring to participate in a project or what have you, right? Versus the associate who's kind of heads down and focused on that one job. And I think sometimes early career professionals go, golly, if I can just dig into this one thing and kind of show my stuff, then others will recognize it. But that's not always the case. It sometimes takes that person who is willing to kind of step up and say, hey, what about me? How can I contribute in multiple ways?
Really, really good advice. The board of directors things we've heard a few times over, and it just rings so true. And a lot of times folks even put some pressure on themselves to find that early board of directors. And I think really the best guidance you give a lot. It's just folks that can give an honest view on you as a professional, and don't put too much pressure on yourself, right? It is step one in a multi-step journey. I'm keen to switch gears a little bit here and talk through the future of work. It's such a buzzword. It's a tagline. You hear so many people talking about it, whether it's professionals, non-professionals, books, whatever. So in your opinion, what does the future of work, what does it actually mean, especially when it comes to talent or managing human capital?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it goes without saying that COVID and the quick pivot that we found ourselves in 2020 led many of us to have the opportunity to work remotely because of the fear of the unknown or safety or what have you. And of course, that's radically transitioned to organization of work over the last few years. And I think the last statistics I saw, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 times as many employees, of course, are working remotely now than pre-pandemic. And it's like 15 or 20% of companies are all fully remote. So, but I what I've seen is a lot of those transitions have been more about how organizations are willing or forced to reorganize work, right? To allow for different worker scenarios as they focus on retention and focus on how they can hunt for talent. But now I think we're seeing that a lot of the thinking behind some of that reorganization is falling into the individual, right? As companies acquiesce, if you will, to allowing workers to be hybrid or fully remote, that implied employer-employee contract shifts, and employees themselves are having to think differently, or I should say talented professionals are having to think differently about how and when they may best contribute to that organization, as well as fulfill their own needs, right? So it's a different give and take on what those folks want and really what they're willing to give up to find the best scenario for them. We've certainly heard the buzzwords of work-life balance, maybe tagged out for work-life integration. And so it's not just about the reorganization of work. We've all reorganized how we approach home life and the shared commitments we have with spouses and partners and kids and as caregivers, right? So to me, a lot of the future of work is, whether it's the hours that people work or in a given day or the intentionality of their tasks or whatever, but particularly those that are hybrid kind of between home and office, I think workers will increasingly expect to have that flexibility.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. My personal bias is oriented around the future of work looks like more hybrid or fully remote than anything else. But I'm curious to know your perspective as somebody who works at a bigger company and sees these decisions coming down the road and really in front of you. What does the future of where we work look like in 1, 3, 5, 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think it is certainly safe to say, of course, that a lot of the workplace changes triggered by the pandemic are not going away. They're not going anywhere, right? And I think we'd all be surprised if any of that proportion of remote work regresses. But I also think that most folks who are in roles that can be done remotely desire some flexibility of being in the office a day or two a week. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago where there was this mounting trend where open offices existed and where that offered what some folks might consider kind of fairly lavish, employee perks and amenities, right? More of a build it and they will come type mentality. But one thing that was certainly very consistent with all of those different scenarios was the expectation of folks being in the office, if not every day, pretty regularly. And so I think many HR executives are working harder on employee engagement than they have historically, whether that's through surveys or stay interviews or open forums or whatever. I think the difference now in a lot of those areas is that companies are actually listening to employee feedback and engaging teams through their organizations to plan and implement a lot of those proposed changes. But in addition to following through on employee suggestions, leaders are also working on ways to engage their workforce and entice them back in the office. So whether it's something as surface level as providing food in the office or something more substantial around more structured mentorship opportunities or finding ways to bring in more diverse and inclusive points of view, whatever it is, right? I think many are engaging employees at all levels in a much more intentional and receptive way.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Good perspective there. Mentioned a few things that I just want to talk through and get your perspective on because I think they're really, really important. And we hear them so often, but building an equitable and inclusive and diverse workforce is something that is not just, let's call it buzzwordy or hot button issue, but it's important. It's not the most important thing you can do for building a culture and building a team. How are you putting mechanisms or thinking through challenges to put initiatives in place that can create and foster that type of workforce, a really diverse, inclusive, equitable workforce today and into the future?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think a couple of things. One, at Genworth, and I probably do need to give my disclaimer. These are my thoughts and opinions, right? Not the official Genworth hat. But at Genworth, we certainly have a very strong intentionality around DE&I, both with our internal workforce as well as how we seek external talent. But we also recognize that the problem of more jobs than talent out there is probably not going away. So we have very intentional efforts from an outward recruiting focus to look at a couple of different areas where, one, we know where we have to have particular skill sets. We're doing all that we can to identify and engage diverse talent with those pools, but also in areas where we can build talent and know that continuously trying to go to market and buy talent in smaller candidate pools where everybody is trying to push each other out of the way to compete for that talent, it's going to get increasingly that much more difficult. So we have a lot of different efforts underway with underrepresented groups that are perhaps don't have access to ways to develop skills or educational opportunities that might skill them up so they're in that first pool I spoke to, but are outstanding candidates that might be able to engage in some of our development programs where we can bring them in to build up that talent. So we just want to make sure it's not a one size fits all approach for any aspects of our business.
Yep. Love that. And companies are treating it with the respect it is due right now. I think it's a long time coming, but from our perspective, when we skill up folks and we see folks coming through our platform, the actual numbers are quite alarming. I mean, in a good way, I mean that. So we have about 65% of our folks identifying or self-identifying as coming from a diverse background and 40+% women. And you don't always see those ratios at every company. So it's something that we put a premium on. And it's nice to hear that in your specific function, you are also taking this very seriously and emphasizing it throughout the culture at Genworth. I do want to chat through one thing that I think is important for our audience as well. When you think about where the world is going, where the future of work is going, and you are talking to potentially folks who are rising up through the ranks, or even folks that are about to embark on that first job, what do you coach them, or how do you help them think through what the workforce looks like maybe 5 or 10 years out and how to best position themselves for success given that new hypothesized climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly it's an interesting pivot, right? In terms of not just how employers and organizations are going to market to look for talent, but that much of that talent at all levels, particularly early career, understanding that even as early career professionals where they may not have as big of a skill set to speak to as more experienced professionals, they still have a lot of leverage in the market. And so I think part of that is kind of resting on maybe who came out of the pandemic and is heading into the next era. As I hate to use the term winners and losers, right? But I think there are employers who were thoughtful and active in recruiting talent, not solely as it was a commodity, but recruited people, right? And created and followed through on genuine promises, from investments in professional development to well-being to inclusion, like all of those kinds of areas. Those are the folks that are the big winners, probably. I know empathy can get thrown around the market a whole lot, particularly in the wake of what's gone on. But empathy is truly it's a very impactful and common word that we use at Genworth. We're a long-term care insurance products and services company. So if empathy doesn't really transcend everything that we do, especially to a policyholder or their caregiver or whomever might be part of that claim process, then our promise to be there for folks at most of the vulnerable times in their lives means nothing. But I don't think that's anything that's just isolated at all to our customers, right? It of course lies with each of our colleagues and things internally, but candidates recognize that too. So I think the big candidate winners are those that were patient and were able to distinguish those companies who were action and not just talk. And in terms of empathy, that were able to recognize those that translated that to genuine focus on employee well-being and inclusion, again, investment, all of those kinds of things. I think candidates, particularly those in early career, who more often than not digging deep into organizations and their social media and what their messaging is, not just from the top down, but from the bottom up, they really recognize whether those things about companies are intentional and authentic or not. And so I know, going back to some of the earlier things that we talked about with early career and the more natural desire for not just their career, but for their job search to be a sprint. I would advise earlier career people to take your time and understand which of those companies do have those genuine values and express that, not just in a public forum, but that kind of walk that walk, both from an internal standpoint with their existing workforce, as well as how they engage candidates. And these candidates recognize that those with whom they interact through the recruiting process, whether they're listening and observing and asking thoughtful questions, and that experience can contribute very well to both sides, candidates, employers alike, in terms of, is it a good fit to bring them together? And again, I just think that interaction resonates with folks more than ever before.
Yeah, really, really good perspective and great thoughts. And you mentioned the word winner at the beginning of this, and I think it's tough to think of it sometimes in terms of winner or loser, but I do think some companies are actually doing better on this avenue and some are actually falling behind. And I'm curious to know your perspective on how technology plays into this. So some of the things that we saw, obviously, going through the pandemic in the beginning phases was, hey, Zoom, clear winner of work, remote, pandemic life, whatever you want to call it, mostly because people needed a way to interact with each other outside of the workforce. And obviously that's subsided a bit as folks get back into workforce environments and go more hybrid than necessarily full remote. But I'm curious to know how you think about technology and what role that actually plays in future of work, future discussions around how people work and what they're going to be doing at work.
Yeah, great question. Without any doubt, of course, technology has enabled us to work remotely in more productive ways than we ever probably envisioned or embraced. I think it starts before that work even begins. It starts with the recruiting cycle, right? We see recruiting processes today where artificial intelligence are included in that process, where candidates are way more apt to respond to text than they are emails, and all of these things that we use in our personal lives that make sense. So certainly, why wouldn't they be part of the talent acquisition process? I think though that in that process, it can be a little bit of a dance. It's important, I think, for both candidates and employers alike to leverage that technology to the greatest extent they can, but also to balance that with intentionally making sure that it doesn't become an impersonal process, right? And I think that bleeds right into the way in which we do work. Technology can um, enable us to do things that we could never do before, but technology can also be isolating. It can prevent us from perhaps understanding intentionality or tone in certain communications. And so, just like we talk about the difference in virtual versus on site and intentionality, I think with technology in different mediums, there has to be an awareness and an intentionality there too of if things are appropriate to be said in text or email, then do it that way. If the good old fashioned way of picking up a phone is more appropriate, do it that way. But when you mix those up, and that certainly I think can sometimes have more of a negative impact than a positive one. But inevitably, certainly industry to industry, it's going to change. But inevitably, technology is only going to increasingly become more and more part of what we do. It's only going to increasingly allow us to work in a more virtual environment. And so folks gotta continue to embrace that in ways that can be productive.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. I think it's really curious today's, I guess let's call it, new gen, or the folks who have only experienced working in the pandemic. It's like a subsection of Gen Z. The prevailing attitude that we see is that we prefer remote work, for better or for worse. That's the preference. And when I think back to my early career, one of the things that I absolutely loved about the first real stop in my journey was we had a massive young team at Groupon, and the interactions that I'd have with coworkers or teammates on my direct team, or my boss, my manager, my manager's manager, the CEO, COO, the CEO, founder, etc., is something that I don't feel you get from just sitting in your room or without other folks around. Even the small interactions, like after meetings where you don't understand something and you can go approach a manager, or you just want to chat about something that just happened in real time, like those are gone. Those are evaporated. There's no way to do that today. And I'm feeling, 2.5 years into this new world, new working world, a craving to get back to something like that. Now, do I want to be in office all the time, mandated at a certain start and end time? Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that we're missing some of that calling, belonging, up leveling, even just ability to spark curiosity and get your curiosity, thirst for curiosity kind of quenched there. It's all gone. And I'm not sure what to do with that, or if it's just, me now as a 10-ish year person in the workforce. That's just an old timers type of mentality, but I don't think it is. I don't think you're ever going to really get back to, or you're ever going to not be able to, or you're not going to be able to recreate like that experience. So that's something that is going to be on my mind for a while if we continue in working remote.
Yeah, I agree. It's an interesting dilemma. I mean, I was just having a conversation earlier this week, and we were kind of brainstorming around what we at least project at this point with what we know. What's our summer intern experience going to look like in 2023, right? And I use experience kind of in maybe with quotes and a question mark associated with it, because pre-pandemic, that was an experience for all three of our development programs, where we brought interns in from all around the country to home base here in Richmond, Virginia. And while certainly making sure that we created a meaningful experience in terms of the work with which people were involved and that side of it, That was probably a third. The other two thirds was more around the experience of it all, of living in a different part of the country and having different social and educational opportunities to interact with folks across the organization and other interns. And while we've had relatively successful internship programs in the last over the last few summers being virtual, it's almost impossible to recreate those same pieces and parts of the experience, right? And I think it's not just a dilemma, certainly that is aligned with those that are early career or part of the internship experience, but from an employer standpoint, I think it's very challenging too, from a retention standpoint, right? Folks that recognize an opportunity, go through the process, onboarded, and work fully remote, in many cases may not feel they have the same level of skin in the game. And so they're not as loyal or vested. And again, I know I'm speaking in generalities, but that's a real live dilemma that certainly we have to deal with in certain scenarios in Genworth. And I know all employers are dealing with is recreating. The word culture is thrown around a lot, right? But it's real. Culture is real, and ideally it's organic and authentic. But it's hard to have an organic and authentic culture that's fully virtual without some intentionality behind it, right?
Yeah, for sure. Really good points. Want to bring up one more thing because I know you mentioned, you have conversations with folks and you're an expert in this field. Who are some of the voices that you pay attention to, either at your own company or out in the wild on the future of work or future of work discussions?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I've always tried to be very intentional since I've had the opportunity to be in a leadership role to listen to colleagues who are in similar roles, both within my industry as well as across multiple industries. So I'm very active in a handful of networking groups where we have the opportunity to, in a more formal sense, pull up quarterly and discuss particular topics that may be, in view for each of us individually or collectively as an industry or a function. But we also have the ability to tap each other. We individually are dealing with certain dilemmas or process improvements or questions or what have you that fall on our immediate plates that we can tap one another for perspectives. And it's been very, very impactful on a lot of the things that we've thought about from a TA perspective at Genworth, because we know that we're certainly not taking just an inside out view, that we have some broad perspective, but it's also, while those things are great, it's also not from just a research document, but that we've talked to professionals who are practicing those very things and can weigh in on what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, and why. And so we're not just kind of rolling the dice based on a white paper. We understand specifically from the actual application as to whether it worked and if it might be something that we want to utilize as a fast follower. So that has been very, very important to what we've done here from a TA perspective, without any question.
Yeah, it's great to hear. Great to hear. Well versed in it, following expert guidance, and then obviously it sounds like going on intuition and some of the things that are true as well. Chad, this has been a really, really inspiring conversation, a thoughtful conversation, a thought-provoking conversation, and appreciate you being a part of it. Where can folks find you if they want to reach out and chat with you about anything, whether it's Genworth, future of work, etc.?
Yeah, Danny, thanks a lot for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. Really enjoyed our conversation as well. I'm on LinkedIn with probably most of the rest of the world, so certainly happy to engage with people through that medium, or if it makes sense for us to connect through that and talk otherwise. Always open to engaging on these topics where there's mutual interest and mutual opportunity to impact one another. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. And for our audience, we hope to have Chad back on the Ramp podcast sometime in the future. For now, we're signing off. Thanks a lot.